as McMinnville, Oregon. Very smoky here. So hopefully wherever you all are, you are safe, whether or not you are in the West Coast or somewhere else. Let us all be safe and whole. And I'm delighted that you have chosen to spend this hour and a half of the day with me. So a little bit about myself. I was raised here in Oregon. I was actually, though, born in the Carolinas. My mom's family is from North Carolina and has been there for about 300 years or so. And I lived in New York City for 13 years. So depending on how much I've had to drink, my accent will shift in many different directions, but I'm not drinking today. So hopefully it will just stay in on this level. But I grew up Roman Catholic. My dad's family is kind of fair weather Catholics showing up on holidays and stuff, but definitely made sure we went through all of the confirmations and the first communions and all the hoo-ha. And I also spent 5 years in Catholic school. I was a very devout young Christian and Catholic. I loved the rituals of Catholicism. I loved its supposed antiquity. My dad's family is. I'm getting some feedback here. Kind of fair weather Catholics showing up on. There we go. Thanks, Rachel. Sorry about that.
Oh, sorry.
It happens. And I had I loved the rituals and the antiquity of the Catholic Church, but I always felt like there was something more that I wasn't quite getting. In addition, my upbringing was strongly influenced by the Southern Baptist traditions. Like I said, my mom's from the mountains of North Carolina, so there was quite a bit of influence there. And some of the things that I appreciated about the Southern Baptist tradition is there was a genuine belief in spirits around, and a belief that the dead could be communicated with, and that there were prayers that could help you with certain things, and that God was in every part of your everyday life and not just in Mass on Sundays. But as I grew older, I started to have many more questions about things. Neither one of these faiths really scratched the itch that I had, which was to get deeper into spirit and deeper into connection with the divine. It always felt like there was something blocking it. In addition, I started to strongly move in a very different direction politically than the church was at the time I was a teenager, and for the large part still is. So I decided I was going to invent my own religion that I was going to call Courtneyism. Courtneyism had some concepts that might sound familiar to some of you. It was a belief that if you just follow what feels right to you, and that is, just respect the paths of others. All in addition, that magic was real and spirits walked among us, and certainly the good folk were never too far away. Reincarnation and all of that, and then God being more of an energy than just some guy up in the sky with a big beard judging all of us. It was lucky for me that as I started to explore more esoteric concepts, that there were a lot of people who thought like I did, and they call themselves Wiccans, pagans, or witches. My journey's taken a lot of different turns. I was ordained Wiccan-ish, I guess. I identified as a Wiccan for a long time, but didn't really go through the traditional degree system. Became a priestess of both Pan and Bridget through two different teachers who saw a lot of potential in me, even when I didn't see it in myself. And quite on accident, I started a coven when I lived in New York City, and it grew very quickly into one of the largest neo-pagan communities in the tri-state area, and I ran that for 9 years. I moved back to Oregon about 3.5 years ago, just feeling really burned out. I'd had absolutely extraordinary experiences in New York and in Ireland and all over the East Coast and in the Midwest, and on California, teaching and learning, but I really wanted to come home. And part of that, I realized I had run away from home to move to New York City, in part to explore my identity as a witch, because it was very hard to be in my hometown where everybody knew me as Catholic Courtney, and I needed to get away from that. So I built a witchcraft identity out there, and soon found that was becoming something I didn't quite understand anymore. And so in a way, as I moved back to where I started from to get away from the identity that I moved to build. And I found myself in a pretty low space when I moved back to Oregon. I wanted to come home, but I also felt very empty and with some depression that I had, been ignoring for a long time, an old eating disorder. My husband and I had been going through fertility treatments for quite a long time, and nothing was really seeming to work. And I found myself in a pretty dark place. A lot of that was because I'd spent a long time focusing on other people's needs and not my own. Um, that is not to make myself sound like a savior. That's actually to point out some pretty acute laziness on my part. It is a lot easier and a lot more fun to focus on other people's problems than your own. That's something I learned. But when you do that, you can find yourself in a pretty tough place. And so I'd spent all this time focusing on magic and teaching it to others, and I was no longer feeling it in myself, which was a terribly lonely place to be. And along that space, I found the Morgan. Now, she had kind of been in the room the whole time, but she and I had never really talked. And I made an offering to her, and I said, I could really use your help with a few things. And if you are willing to help me, I will write a book for you. So I've learned very quickly in my work, especially with the Celtics and the Irish deities, that they are very serious about your word, and you can't do it halfway. You need to do it as you said you would. So I kept my word, and the Morgan kept hers, and so I'm delighted to be able to share things with you today. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay. Oh, silly thing, open bigger. There you go. All right. If at any point, friends, that the PowerPoint stops playing, this happened to me earlier this year, let me know and I can restart it. Um, okay. All right. The Morgan, the Celtic goddess of magic and might. All right. So let's take a few minutes and talk about who is the Morgan. All right. Well, the Morgan is actually, that identity is kind of nebulous and also depends on what source you're reading and who you talk to. We'll get deeper into this in a minute, but the Morgan is not specifically one goddess. Sometimes the Morgan is classified as several different goddesses. Sometimes the Morgan is classified as one with very different aspects. But we're going to talk about some of the different traits that the Morgan has that may not be familiar to everyone. So the Morgan is not just a goddess of warfare, which is what she is especially known for. She's also known for being a queen and a sovereign goddess, as well as a death omen. In some tellings, she's even a mother. In other tellings, she's a murderer. In some stories, she's a lover and also a spy and a conspirator. And depending on who you talk to, she is a member of the good folk, sometimes known as the fairies. And she is a shapeshifter. Sometimes she's classified as a healer, and sometimes she's even classified as a living earth itself. Let's get a little bit of context for this. All right, so let's first talk about the Celtic world, which is something that is commonly misunderstood. Sorry about that clawing at the door. I've got a dog who really wants my attention, but he's not coming in right now. So we often associate the Celts with Ireland and sometimes with Great Britain, Wales, and Scotland. But the truth is that the Celtic Empire was absolutely enormous. So everywhere you see that's colored in yellow and green is the Celtic world, and actually originated in Central Europe and spread outward. But as you can see, the Celts had strongholds as far east as Turkey, as far west as Spain, as far south as Spain, but also into areas of the Mediterranean and France. One of the reasons that we associate the Celts more with Ireland than we do these other parts of the world is that most of Europe was eventually conquered by Rome. And Rome took over the Celtic world before it later became more of a Christian world. And so there's a layer of colonization in that space, which has tended to shift our thinking a little bit. But it's actually very funny. As I was talking to a German citizen just a couple of weeks ago, who says he fully identifies as a Celt, and he's right. As you can see, Germany is right in the middle of the Celtic world. This is a people whose civilization covered all of Europe. And so we're really talking more about a timeline than we are a specific people. So this Celtic empire existed from roughly 1000 BCE, otherwise known as BC, to about 500 CE, give or take a few centuries. This is a very vast, eclectic culture, different languages, different religious practices, um, different customs. Some have wondered if Ireland should even be considered a Celtic nation, considering how different these different practices are. The two things that archaeologists have said that unify this world are similar burial rites and weaponry. So those are really the only two things that give this world any kind of uniformity at all. Aside from that, it's incredibly diverse. So we say that it's important to recognize that, especially as we've had probably a decade or two of largely American writers tending to homogenize Celtic stuff, and instead of acknowledging that these are very independent, different people. So with that being said, let's move to the next slide. At the same time, we don't really know a whole lot about the Celts. Most of what we know about them came from texts that were written about them by their enemies, who were the Romans down south, and who had some very specific intentions for a very sensational bent on who these people were. The Celts wrote very little. This was by design. It's not that they couldn't write, it's that they chose not to. As a whole, they believe that they're in keeping their histories and mythologies through oral tradition, believing that it was better for them to, better for their minds to memorize it than to read. This was something that even Julius Caesar down in Rome agreed with. We don't really know what the Irish Celtic religious practices were like. Other than it was likely based largely on the observation of omens, rituals, and adherence to very specific taboos. And therefore, we don't know very much about the Morrigan as she was originally, or as they were originally worshipped. The stories about the Morrigan are very sensational, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One, these stories were written down by Christian monks several centuries after Ireland had largely become a Christian nation. And it may have been that the Christian monks, in penning these down, were really either only interested in or only allowed to write down stories that made the old the old Irish gods look scary. Not a lot of people could read or write, and like we're talking like the year 400 to 600 Common Era, and so it's like dedicating your most learned, valuable person who can read and write to, to write down the stories of a different religion that you're trying to abolish. That's that they're probably not going to be the people that are paying the priests or the monks are probably not going to be as excited to see something that is that glorifies them. But it's also possible that these were just the stories that survived. Like I said, Christianity had become largely the dominant religion for several hundred years before these had been written down. So it's possible that the stories were just not being told in their original form as commonly as they once were. And so if you imagine, I ask this story a lot of people, who among you, think about it, to tell yourself the story of As You Like It by Shakespeare. See if you can call to mind what it's about. Most people, unless they're Shakespeare buffs, can't think of it right away or may not be even familiar with it. But I guarantee you everybody knows Romeo and Juliet. Same thing if I say Much Ado About Nothing. Yeah, maybe you saw the Emma Thompson movie, but aside from that, how much of it do you recall? But I'll bet you recall some key things from Macbeth. So here's the thing. Romeo and Juliet was about sex and death, and Macbeth was about death and witchcraft. Those are the things that excite us, right? The scary stories are the ones that stay with us. I have never seen A Nightmare on Elm Street, a movie from beginning to end. I've just seen clips of it during Halloween time. But I already know that it's about Freddy Krueger and that he was a gardener and something with the boiler and he killed people in their sleep, because that's kind of stories that stick with us. But we don't all know the stories of Citizen. We don't know the story of Citizen Kane, right? So we can imagine that perhaps the storyteller who is relaying these stories to the monk might be saying, there was a story my grandfather used to tell, and I haven't heard it since I was 5 or 6 years old. Here's what I remember. Well, that person is probably going to remember a story that scared them to death that they heard when they had 5 or 6, rather than one that's, genteel and sweet about a goddess naming the flowers. No idea if that was ever part of the Morrigan or not, but it's something just to consider in this context. We just don't know a lot about these old gods, and what we have is pretty sensational, just for basically human nature. Okay. All right. So, possible origins of the Morrigan can include that the Morrigan may have evolved from a collection of prehistoric deities from different Irish tribes. So, the Celts were not the first people to settle in Ireland. There had been a group of people that were there originally that had been there since the since the ice age, and so it's possible that when the Celts migrated into Ireland, that they brought their own gods from different parts of the world. And then these different Irish tribes are sharing their stories, and they're all influenced by prehistoric deities that were either similar or just kind of fell into the stories about them. Now, while some Celtic deities, including Brigid, may have roots on the mainland or in other countries, the Morgan is solely Irish. Okay, Bridget has some roots in Great Britain and sometimes even France, but the Morgan is strictly Irish. A lot of people have asked if she is connected with Morgan Le Fay. Um, and historically speaking, no, she was not. Morgan Le Fay really came into literature almost 1,000 years later, and in Wales essentially. And there's not enough of a connection that's unique to the two of them to really say that these two are connected. Now, spiritually speaking, if they're coming to you in a vision the same way, that's your experience, and no one's going to tell you that that is an invalid spiritual experience. But historically speaking, no, the Morgan and the Morgan Le Fay were not the same goddess, and Morgan Le Fay is Welsh, and the Morgan is Irish. Okay. But a few more clues about the Morgan may come through her name. So the Morgan is Old Irish and likely means nightmare queen. Morrigan or Morrigan is spelled this way are later Irish versions that likely meant great queen. I'm going to shrink this up so you guys can see it better. Okay. And then other interpretations included Queen of the Phantom, Sea Queen, or Queen of the Slain. The Morgan is also described as a demonic flying creature, as well as a member of distinctly nasty beings. This is very common among Irish lore, is that the gods would have like more of a title than specifically a name. So even like Brigid was really meant the exalted one. The Dagda meant the good god, or the many skill, the god that was just great at lots of things. And then the Morrigan herself may have meant one of these versions. It's also important to point out that Nightmare Queen may not have meant bad dream as much as nightmare being some kind of visitation in the night. Okay. So as I mentioned, the Morrigan may be a generic title for a collection of goddesses. We're going to really just focus on 3 of them in this talk today, but I will touch on some of the other ones. So Morrigu, who is also called the Morgan, was known for inciting strife and deeds of courage, wisdom, and prophetic abilities. Connected in some thoughts with wealth and fertility, could appear as beautiful or ugly. And then we have the Bive, who is symbolizing or represented battle, rage, and witchcraft, inciting confusion among armies, and would often revel among the slain. Bive could prophesize the death of powerful men and could appear as a young woman, an old hag, or a collection of Royston crows. Okay. Macha was the third one, who is a prophet, a warrior, and a matriarch, maybe even an historical queen, who represented sovereignty and fertility of Ireland. Macha, as we'll see, could be very vengeful when they were wrong. So people have asked me if one of the reasons these are all connected is all 3 were called the daughters of Ernmas. Ernmas may have actually meant murder. So these 3 goddesses were certainly ones that kept people on edge and made them very nervous. So some people have asked, are they one goddess? And I say yes. And then they say, are they several goddesses? And I also say yes. I think about it this way. If you ever come to my family's house for a holiday, you'll meet my mother and her 3 sisters. Now, these are 3, obviously, it's to be 4 very different women. They live in different parts of the country. And although that they grew up in the same household, or very different people. But there's always going to be that moment when they really get going on something. And it sounds like one person is talking at the same time because they kind of get into that zone. And we all have people like that in our lives, our very close friends. We're different people, but we're also kind of the same person. I look at it this way. I personally do see them as different goddesses, but I also know that sometimes they can all come at me at once, and it might as well just be one. All right. Um, there we go. Sorry. Okay. All right. So other Morgan sister names, the Anu was sometimes considered to be an alternative name for Morrigu, a goddess of wealth, thought to be a mother of the gods, said to have nursed other deities. Danu is sometimes believed to be a sister of the Morgan, meaning her name meaning sacred waters, may have been a mother or ancestor of the gods, or a title for a regional land goddess. Naaman is another goddess that tends to show up alongside the Morgan sisters as well. Very shadowy early Irish war goddess represented by a crow, known to confound enemies to the point where even friends slaughter one another. Don't know much about her, just that she showed up in some very key battles and caused a lot of problems for people. And the last one that would appear with the other Morgan sisters is sometimes is Fea, who is sometimes called the Hateful. So Fea is known for hovering over fighters, inspiring madness in battle, and reveling over the slain. And Fea may be helpful in navigating chaotic situations. Again, Naaman and Fea are two that we just don't know very much about. Don't have myths that specifically tell us their stories. We just know that they would show up and throw some real power around. So yes, the Morgan is often thought of first as a goddess or a collection of goddesses dedicated to battle. Why might this be? Okay, so the Celts were typically believed to be a pretty heavily warfaring society. And in it, the status of the warrior was very highly sought out. Warriors began fighting at a very early age, and mock battles were part of everyday life, including after social events. Now, geographically, this was strategic because the Celtic world was quite vulnerable to foreign invasion. But even internally, tribes often fought one another for their chief form of currency. Now, in Ireland, this chief form of currency was cattle. So if you're down a few cattle, you don't really have time to wait for them to produce more. You might go raid the Tua or the kingdom next door for either the land for the cattle itself or the land that the cattle would be living on. So Irish warriors were thought to be especially fierce. This might be a reason why Rome never actually colonized Ireland. A couple of schools of thought it may be that Rome ran out of resources by the time they got to England and colonized England and just couldn't go any further west. But because the Irish were believed to be or had a reputation for being very, very powerful fighters, they may not have actually gone any further west. But still, even so, the wars of the Celts were not on the scale of today's wars. Sometimes we imagine things like the Game of Thrones Battle of the Bastards or the Red Wedding, not the Red Wedding, the Battle of the Bastards or Battle of Blackwater Bay. Sorry, getting in there. Or Lord of the Rings or Braveheart, where you have like thousands of people, butchering each other on the battlefield. It was more likely to be a collection of maybe the 6 most fierce warriors. So maybe 6 or even a dozen guys are going to go and, and challenge the 6 or 12 most powerful guys at the other kingdom to battle. So there was believed to be a great deal of ceremony around this, which include recounting the deeds of ancestors, taunting the opponents, and grieving after killing your opponent. So Celtic women, including Irish Celtic women, have fought directly on the battlefield. Some may have gone to battle themselves with weapons and actually participated in that way. But there's a lot of evidence that says, or accounts that said that they kind of stood near the battlefield to raise the spirits and taunt them if they needed to be. So they were cheering on their men, but they were also making sure that they would stay on the battlefield and not run away. Because if you get scared on the battlefield, it's going to be bad enough that your fellow soldiers or fellow warriors see you run away. But isn't it going to be so much worse when your wife, your sisters, your sister-in-law, your mom, your mother-in-law, your grandma, all of them are there and see that you ran away from the battle. So they would really stay and make sure that the men did their job. They also had a very important role in contributing psychological warfare. So the women would often scream and contort their faces, emulating or trying to evoke the spirits of birds, not vultures specifically, but scavenger birds that would come and follow the battlefield and pick the corpses clean. So whether they were inspiring that energy to come and attack the opponent, or whether they were simply trying to scare their opponent, it was incredibly important work. Sometimes they would actually start screaming and screeching before the warriors would even approach the other warriors and invite them to battle. And sometimes, if they were scary enough, the other two I might say, you know what, we're not going to mess with these people today. Just give them the cows and let's go home. Right. So women were really key, which is one of the reasons why the Morrigan was so key in her own battles. Okay. I'm working with two computers here. So, all right. So this is the first Battle of Mochura, very old story of Ireland, in which the Tuatha De Danann have first landed on Ireland and have said to come in from ships on the sky. Now that makes my my conspiracy theory alien loving friends really excited. I think that it wasn't necessarily spaceships, but I think that the story that the ships were coming from overseas and perhaps from the horizon line where the clouds met the water, it looked like they were coming out of the sky. Well, anyway, the island was already occupied by the Firbolg, sometimes called the people of the bag. And their high king Yokid had a terrifying dream of a flock of black birds that came from the depths of the ocean that would bring forth destruction. Now, we don't know what specifically the symbolism meant to the ancient Irish. What we do know is that blackbirds, and in some accounts the ocean too, may have resonance with the Morgan sisters. So meanwhile, the Thurbolg's wizards, Kessard, who was said to be highly skilled in every art, said that, no, sorry, he said that a people skilled in every art would take over the island and an evil spirit would lead them astray. So the Thurbolg ambassador met with Bress, the Tuatha De Danann ambassador, something that you need to remember because we'll talk about him next. Bress was not actually a member of the Tuatha De, but of the Fomorians, who were the allies of the Tuatha De Danann. And Bress offered terms. Either the tribes would peacefully split Ireland in two, and they would all live there, or they would engage in battle. Well, the Thurbolg opted for battle, and so the Tuatha De moved west in order to make their battle plans. Okay. So while this was going on, Baive, Macha, and the Morgan made a preemptive strike against the Firbolg. The three went to Tara and sent forth magic showers of sorcery, compact clouds of mist, a furious rain of fire, and a downpour of red blood from the air on the Firbolg warriors' heads, allowing their enemies neither rest nor stay for 3 days and nights. A poor thing, said the Firbolg, that the sorcery of our sorcerers cannot protect us from the sorcery of the Tuatha De. So in the end, the three sisters attacked them until the Firbolg backed down and split the island. So this story may actually be as old as the Bronze Age, which is a few thousand years old, potentially marking a period in history when immigrating groups clashed with already existing groups in Ireland. This may be a warning tale about negotiating, and not in that, negotiating, sharing is better than battle. An Irish friend of mine said that a lot of these stories are teaching tales and teach people basically how to be in the world and how to be amongst one another. And also sometimes warnings of what not to do. The Tuatha De, the Firbolg may have also been forces of nature, and the Tuatha De may have been the learning how people were living in this new world and learning to work with these different elements. But through this story, we learned that the Morgan sisters have control over forces of nature, bringing down fire from the sky. This may have been lightning. This may have been actual fire, and maybe maybe there was a forest fire going on. Who knows? But they also work as magical consultants who stood along the battlefield with other women, where it's insinuating that later they helped with screaming on the fields as and encouraging their men to keep fighting. All right, so part two, in the second battle of Mochura. So Bress, who we remember from the previous story, who was a Fomorian and an ambassador for the Tuatha De, he and other of the Fomorians have actually taken over the Tuatha De and forced them into servitude. So the Tuatha De plan a revolt. This is a very long battle. It goes through many ebbs and flows. We don't have time to do it all today. But basically, as soon as one side would start to become victorious, they would then find themselves exhausted. So the Morrigan begins to pursue and hunt the enemy. She meets and she has a love tryst with the Dagda, aka the good dog, good god, and she gives him very crucial battle information. She then meets with his enemies at the ford with blood in her two palms and kills the entire battalion. She is also the one who can command the kings to rise to battle. At the end of the battle, they all look to the Morrigan as though it is only she who can announce the victory to both the humans and the she or the fairies, and then also offers a prophecy of the end of the world. Make sure I realize I can't see the chat, so I'm going to see if I can pull that up real quick in case anybody has any questions. All right, I am not seeing it. Okay, Rachel, I'm sorry. If there's a bunch of questions, let me know. And we can make sure that I can answer them as we go along. Okay. All right. So I love these images of the Morrigan. I find them very, very beautiful, but there's something about them that is not actually accurate to the Morrigan. If we were all together, I'd have people call out their answers. So I will give you all a second to think on it, and then I'll tell you what it is. Besides them being all young, skinny, and white, something about them is not quite accurate to the Morrigan. I'm wondering if you can figure out what it is. So it is actually weaponry. The Morrigan never lifts a single weapon in any of her myths. Her tools are her voice, and in some cases her body, but ultimately her strategy. Okay, she works with the kings to figure out their plan, and then sometimes she uses her voice in order to make them rise to battle when they start to become tired. She's also the one that can survey the battle and tell everybody when it's over. Okay. The only act of violence we see is when she approaches her enemy with 2 handfuls of blood. We really don't know what that means. Okay. All right. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit because we don't have tons of time. Okay. So the washer at the ford, the queens of death and prophecy. So this is perhaps one of the more frightening images of the Morrigan, which is the sister's guide as the washer at the ford, which is typically something that is embodied by the Bive. So the names of the Morrigan sisters were frequently used in metaphors for severed heads or heaped corpses of the slain. Naturally, as a goddess that is so deeply connected to battle, it makes sense that she would also be connected to death, as obviously death is pretty common in battle. But more so than that, I've asked people have said that she is a goddess of death, and I think we're missing some context. She's not specifically a goddess who comes to collect. She's not a grim reaper, so to speak. She doesn't show up and bring death with her. She also, with the exception of a few rare cases, doesn't really collect souls and ferry them away. She is more of a goddess who warns that death is imminent and can be avoided if certain things are done differently. So she is more of a death omen, I would say, than a death goddess, depending on if you go with what I experienced to be the typical view of a death goddess. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about what the death might have meant for the Celts. There really was no single god of death. The exception maybe being the god Dawn. I don't know a whole lot about him, so he may have more of the Hades, Grim Reaper role to the Celts in the Irish traditions than others. But there really wasn't a deity of death in that way. And the world of the dead was not all that simple. The dead were believed to coexist alongside the living, and they were very active in the lives of the living, communicating through dreams, and could be accessed through rituals or visiting these the great funeral mounds. They're sometimes called the she mounds. We're looking at one here. These were built by Stone Age Irish people, and they were used as basically great tombs that housed the bodies of the most important people in the community. So the Celts used these a little bit, but mostly they stayed away from them. They recognized them as places of death and a place that you could connect with the ancestors, but they also recognized that these were places that they felt were very scary and largely wanted nothing to do with them. Here's the image of the inside of one of those burial cairns. They were also used as kind of like a farmer's almanac, depending on when the sun would enter in at certain points of the year, and highlight specific carvings on the wall may have helped the pre-Celtic Irish figure out where they were supposed to plant crops or where they were supposed to harvest or hunt and that sort of thing. A lot of mysteries surrounding these. So the Tuatha De Danann, who were the Morrigan's people, it's possible that they were considered ancestors as well as gods. This is a very fuzzy line. They were except when they weren't, and they weren't except when they were. So because there may have been some connection to ancestry, because the Morgan sisters were also part of the Tuatha De Danann, they may have been seen as having connections to the ancestor world, and that they certainly could straddle the world between, what am I seeing here? Okay, I've got a couple chats there. Okay. I have thought of her as a goddess reclaiming the slain to return them to earth as though by consumption by crows. Is this view supported by the mythology? Possibly. There is one myth in which she sits with the goddess, the hero Cuchulainn, as he is dying in the form of blackbirds. And it said that she sat on his shoulder until he passed away and that he left. And then she left. So some have thought that she might have been then taking his soul to the next realm, but that's not really explicitly said. It is possible that the Irish believed that, but it's not clearly defined by mythology. No. Okay. So, all right, skipping to the next thing here. Okay. By it being a death omen. Okay. So when delivering morbid prophecies, the Morgan sisters, or in this case, the Bive, could appear as a beautiful young woman or a hideous hag, either alone or in triplicate. Bive in particular is known for being red-mouthed, which may have been an allusion to being a death prophet. Red was the color of death, perhaps for obvious reasons because of running blood. And so when Bive was appearing red-mouthed, it's not certain whether she was gushing blood from her mouth and therefore that was prophesizing the death, or because she was speaking about death, that her mouth was said to be red as a result. Okay. So sometimes called the washer or the banshee, which is sometimes called the fairy woman. Appearances of this character appear throughout Irish mythology and oral tradition. Okay, it is sometimes said that a soldier going off to war, if he comes across a woman washing in a river, it is his own bloody uniform she washes, and he will not return home. Okay. Sometimes it was said that the washers were believed to be the souls of women who died in childbirth. These washers or banshees are believed to be connected to the Bive, because the Bive in one of her mythologies in one of her myths says that she is of the Tuatha De Danann, which connects her to the Morgan sisters. And so it's believed that this might have been a descendant of the belief that the war goddesses would be able to prophesize a death when they would scream on the battlefield. But it's truly a very, very old ancient tradition. Okay. What am I doing next? Okay. Reading a quick myth. All right. So the Bive appears as a red woman at a ford washing a chariot, the water turning bloody and full of spoils. She explains, "I wash the horse harness of a man who will perish." Later in the story, Later in the story, Bive appears as a big-mouthed, dark, eager, dusky woman described as lame and squinting with her left eye, wearing a threadbare cloak which is covered in soot. Her gray hair falls over her shoulders, her lips are on one side of her head, and she shares a prophecy that there will be more mangled bodies, including necks without heads. Now, she's not just doing this to be mean. Okay, so in Iron Age or Celtic Ireland, a king was bound by a lot of strict restrictions, and it was believed that if he broke any of them, he would upset the land spirits and the other spirits, and then he would be punished, and therefore all of Ireland would be punished as well. So he had a very important job, which was basically to not screw up. So you can probably imagine that in this story, this king is going along, and he sees the Bive who says, "Look, buddy, you are screwing up. If you don't change your ways, you're going to die. You are breaking all of your taboos. Now, spoiler alert, he doesn't listen. Okay. Later in a similar myth, there's a room of bives where 3 naked women with jets of blood coming through them are running around with ropes of slaughter about their necks. Okay. The death of Cuchulainn. The bive appears at the top as a crow atop the house where the hero resided, uttering magic words leading to his downfall. Somebody says, sound familiar in the US with Trump. You know, I told somebody, or I've said recently, I feel like our modern day bives are our climate scientists. They have been screaming and shouting for years to our leaders that if we don't change our ways, we're in for a lot of trouble. And our climate scientists, very much like the bive in these stories, who the bives are often threatened and the king's soldiers rush her and try to kill her. Our climate scientists are seeing the same thing, whether it's through funding being slashed, or they're being silenced, or they're being threatened. Their lives are literally being threatened for warning about climate change. Okay. A couple other places. So, and sometimes I think that this is one of the reasons why the Morgans and the bive get such a bad reputation, is because Cuchulainn was considered to be a great hero. He was also a big misogynist, as we will dig in as we get into this later. And very few people can kill him, but the Morgan and the bive seem to, or are said to invite that to him. And somebody asked earlier about the Morgan being a psychopomp and the blackbirds ferrying the souls away. It's possible that's what happened with Cuchulainn, that when he died, she collected his soul and brought it away, but it's never explicitly said. So the reason that the Morgan and the bive are connected with the blackbirds so much is that birds would follow battlefields and pick the corpses clean. It's very, very morbid, especially scavenger birds. The Celtic Irish may have also believed that birds were intermediaries for the gods. And sometimes today people say that if you know, all of a sudden you're getting a bunch of blackbirds in your house that, or near your house that the Morgan is calling. I would not go so far as to say that every single time you see a crow that the Morgan is coming your way. But I do think if you see blackbirds, crows, ravens, I would even say here in the United States, we have turkey buzzards and vultures. They don't have those in Ireland, but I feel they embody the same purpose here. If they act strangely or differently, then I believe that it's an omen. I can tell you from recent experience that I got a phone call while I was out walking my dog, and it was the story of getting word that a friend of mine had taken her life. And just as I was told that, 2 black turkey buzzards flew over my head, very, very low. Not just like I saw them off in the distance. I live kind of out in the country, so I see a lot of turkey buzzards, but I rarely see them so close and so low over my head. And then I heard later that day that another friend of mine had almost lost her life to a drug overdose. So that to me symbolized certainly that the Morgan warning me about some friends of mine that had either passed away or were in trouble. And then it happened again a few days later, and that I was walking along and a turkey buzzard flew out of the bushes not 2 feet from me and up into a tree and stared at me. And then I got the word later that day that another friend had passed away. So again, every time I see a crow or a turkey buzzard, I don't say that, oh, okay, definitely that's the Morgan calling. But when they act strangely or unusual, then I would suspect that something's going on there. So but even in this, if the Morgan is symbolized by blackbirds, it's also, you think about these birds performing a natural life cycle. You know, you want to have scavenger birds, you want to have scavenger animals. If you didn't have them, then you've got like rotting flesh, you know, whether it's of an animal or in this case, someone on the battlefield. And that these birds would literally do the dirty work of removing flesh before it would become contaminated, potentially contaminating water sources or you know, poisoning livestock or anything like that. So although it can be very scary and ominous, it's possible that there may have been an understanding of this being part of a natural life cycle as well. I have to include this next one, although we don't have tons of time, but I just love this description of the bive so much. It makes me want to scream. It's so good. So over the lake, an apparition arose. A lone great stooped, blue-faced, wretched, hunched back, gray-toothed, coarse-furred, crooked-nailed, tall, lean, spectral, squinting, Watery-eyed, crooked, bend-shaped red hag with shaggy, rough-stranded, garlanded hair rough as heather, red and green, which resembled seaweed, with a pile of heads, a load of spoils, and a heap of arms and legs, which she scrubbed and firmly washed at the edge of the bank of the lake, so that all the water, its entire course, was full of hair and brains. So not subtle, right? When the warriors asked her name, she replies, "My name is Bronach," meaning sorrowful, of Burin, and the Tuatha Danu is my noble lineage. This litter is your men's heads, O high noble king, with your own head at the very center, for it is not your own, although you wear it. And although you proceed proudly to the site of contention, there is but a short time between you and your misery, for all but a few will be slaughtered. When the men tried to attack her, she arose hurriedly with the rushed wind and delivered this prophecy of doom. I tell you, your expedition is lamentable. The course east will bring great calamity. Later in the story, the warriors try to dismiss her as just being a Bive. Whatever, she's just a woman. Whatever, she's just a climate scientist. She's just a blah, blah, blah. Let's not listen to her, all right? But then she appears again, and with great exertion, old armor, satin clothing, noble jerkins made of gold thread, elegant shirts of fine silk, and splendid imported goods, and all the spoils and garments of the host, so that the river below her was made a single stream of water and blood, while from above her beautiful sunlit droplets flowed in fierce, murmuring azure torrents of pure water over level sand. Now, I don't know what these symbols all meant to actually this story comes from medieval Ireland. So a couple hundred years into Christian Ireland, you can see these characters that come from a very pagan Ireland are still very much alive and well in the vernacular. But I see this as them saying your gold won't protect you if you've broken your vows, right? You know, there's not enough wealth in the world to protect you from the danger that's coming for you not doing what you were supposed to do. All right. Okay. Moving on to the next one. Okay. So a goddess potentially among the fairies. Lots of controversy on this one. Bear with me. So I probably don't need to say it to anyone in this group anymore. We're not talking about these kinds of fairies. Okay. Disney and pop culture have done quite a number on the lore of the fairies, and one thing in believing that they exist solely to help humans, that they are even remotely interested in humans, and that their only goal is to make humans happy. When in reality, I think if the Celtic Irish could depict fairies, they'd probably depict them more like this. Okay, scary beings who are best to be left alone. All right. So the fairies could be cruel and cunning, beautiful as well as ugly, helpful to human. Okay. All right. Beautiful, ugly, helpful to humanity. They could bless farm production. They could be troublesome, cursing butter and stealing babies. They were often blamed for calamities that would befall people living in a rural environment. And they were also believed to be occasionally dangerous, hunting humans down for sport. Basically, they're not good or bad. They are a different set of beings that have different cultures and classes, but most importantly, they do not exist solely for the bidding of humanity. Okay. So some theories about who, I'm just going to pop all these up here. Okay. Like I said, I'm doing two different computers over here. Okay, so they were thought to be maybe ancestors similar to the Tuatha Danu. They were sometimes the dead, except when they weren't, and they sometimes weren't the dead, except when they are. That quote goes to the mighty Morrigan Daimler, who explained it so perfectly. It's also believed they might have been the original inhabitants of Ireland that then went into the she-mounds when, or underground when the Celtic and later the modern Irish moved in. Common thing that's said about the fairies in Ireland: not a good enough for heaven, not bad enough for hell. Maybe demoted gods of early religions or descendants of animal spirits. Sometimes the wandering souls of the dead. Some stories have said that people have found have seen their deceased loved ones walking alongside the fairies and sometimes not. Some say that they wake people, in some stories, somebody wakes up in the fairy world and learns that they have died in the mortal world. But really the term, the fairies or the good folk, was a term for a number of spiritual beings, including the leprechaun and the selkie, who was a sea being, sometimes a seal, one that could become human and marry a mortal, married only until they could recover their original seal skin. Okay. Even as Christianity became the dominant religious force in Ireland, there was a belief that the fairies were still very much among them and were certainly part of the culture. I mean, even today, you get a lot of people who I've listened to interviews with modern Irish people where they say, "Oh no, I'm not. I don't sit around worrying about the fairies. I don't believe in them, but I definitely would not visit a she mound at night, or I would not go mess on the bog, and I would certainly not want them to bother me." Also, another famous saying in Ireland is, "I don't believe in fairies, but I wouldn't want to cross one." So, which is kind of, I think, is a safe way of being. So, couple other things that are important to note about them, which helps us look at the connection. Yeah, right's right. Better be safe than sorry. There's no. So on the holidays of Bealtaine and Samhain, they could travel freely through the human lands, go to war amongst themselves, and some believe that humans that died before their time were believed to live alongside the fairy. We could go down into the rabbit hole for a while, but it's thought that fairies' interference in human life answers some of the most puzzling of life's mysteries, especially about the untimely death of young people, epidemics among cattle, climate disaster and disease. If cattle went missing, then people might think that a fairy stole them, or if a baby might suddenly develop colic and be very difficult, it was thought they might be considered a changeling. Fairies were also believed to direct human warfare and control the natural phenomenon, and even had the power to make harvest prosper or rot. In some areas, fairies were blamed for the Ireland's Great Famine, which was believed is sometimes to contributed to disturbed conditions in the fairy world. Okay, one theory that I like to explore is that they may have been a foreign people at one time. Remembering that the Celtic world was composed largely of insular communities, so mortal foreigners with a different language, maybe different technology, different knowledge of the plants, can do different healings, might have been considered different enough where people thought they were a different species, that they weren't human, that they were divine. And maybe these people were very protective and could, might somebody crossed over, may not let them come back out. And because territories were often divided by rivers or mountains or other natural landscape, these kinds of things were often associated with the fairies. So all of that to say, the Morrigan is not I don't want to say the Morrigan is a fairy goddess. I go so far as to say the Morrigan has a timeshare in the fairy world. Okay, and that the Morrigan sisters certainly act like fairies. In some translations, the Bibe was called the Bad Fairy, and the Morrigan was called the Great Fairy. And then Maka acts as a fairy in one of her more famous myths. So the sisters, although they are still known as goddesses and not specifically as fairies, sometimes they certainly act like fairies. They steal cattle. As we saw, the Bive could manifest both in the air and in watery places. As we saw at the beginning, the Morrigan could pass in and out of hills and mounds typically associated with the Sidhe. Now, Maka in particular curses mortals who cross or injure them. They go to war, and they have knowledge of the realms of the dead. Okay, so I'm going to call out we Yanks for a moment, because we tend to really be hung up on our boxes and our check boxes. Is it a this goddess? Is it a that goddess? Are you a goddess of these things? Are you not a goddess of these things? That kind of box checking really doesn't work when you're looking at Irish mythology or Irish folklore customs. There is a lot of liminality there, a lot of yes and no, a lot of both and a lot of fluidity. So I invite you, especially as you get deeper into your work with the Morrigan, is not try to solve contradictions or try to check boxes, but more embrace contradictions and embrace that boxes aren't always going to get checked. Okay, so here we go. So one of this is an important myth. The Morgan as the fairy, or the Morgan sister as fairy, the debility of the Ulstermen. So I am not going to read this totally because we just don't have enough time. So I'm just going to give you the sense of it. So you've got a wealthy widow who's living alone. He's just kind of lonely. And one day, a really beautiful woman just approaches him and she moves into his house and she starts cooking and cleaning for him. And she keeps him warm and cozy at night. And she essentially becomes his wife, right? And as long as she's with him, he doesn't want for anything. His cattle flourish, his business is good, everything's great. She asks him only for one thing. So she gets pregnant with twins and she's getting really close to giving birth. And her husband's going to go off to a fair, not an affair, to a fair. And she said, listen, I think it's great that you're going to go to the fair, but if you tell people about me, then our marriage is not going to continue. He's like, no problem, no problem, no problem. I won't say a single word. All right. So the problem is he probably has a few drinks when he gets to the fair and he's watching the king's horses race. Everybody's praising the king. Oh my God, the king's horses are so fast. Nobody's faster than the king's horses. Well, this guy all of a sudden stands up and he's like, well, nobody's faster than my wife, which I don't know why in the world he would say that. Why are you comparing your wife to a horse? I don't know. There's context there culturally and historically speaking that I don't have. Anyway, the king overheard it and he's like not having it. So he insists that his men go bring his wife and demand that she race his horses right then and there. Again, she's 9 months pregnant with twins and says to them, listen, if you don't race race the king's horses, we're going to chop your husband to bits. And so she's in a really tough position. She's like, can I at least give birth first? And they say, no, you're going to race right here. And she turns to the crowd and she says, listen, all of you have mothers. You were each born to a mother. Can you at least have mercy for me? And everyone's like, no. All right. So then she curses them all. Shame on you. Because you have shown me no mercy, calamity will fall upon you. And she declares herself as Maka, the daughter of the strange son of the ocean. And she declares that her name will forever be on the place that they stand today and demands the horses be brought to her. So she races the horses. And when she gets to the finish line, she gives birth to the twins. And as she's dying, she cries out, because of the cruelty you have shown me today, I curse you with thus. When troubles shall befall before you, when you are raided by enemies, you will experience the weakness that I know today. And you will experience it for 5 days and 4 nights, allowing your enemies to crush you in the way you have crushed me. This affliction begins today and lasts for 9 generations. So from that day, the place where the fair was held is called Amen Maka, the twins of Maka. And this was the cause, the debility of the Ulstermen. So that's another important myth that we're going to experience. Okay, I like that picture. All right. So let's switch over to the goddess of sovereignty. Don't forget, you are welcome to add your questions into the group chat. I can see it here and I'm happy to answer whatever I can. Okay. So it's a disappointment to some that a goddess-based culture could still be pretty patriarchal. And to be fair, the Celtic world was not the Mists of Avalon dream that a lot of us would like to believe. The Celtic world was still quite controlled by men, and women did not have a lot of power. Now, certain Celtic queens had great power and renown, as we know that Macha may have been based on a historic queen who ruled all of Ireland. Queen Boudica in England certainly was a powerful queen, but these queens were certainly an anomaly and not the norm. Now, widows could enjoy certain protections, and in some cases, women could hold roles as judges and lawyers. In other parts of the Celtic world, they may have become druidesses, but the Celtic society was still very much run by men. Women really couldn't inherit property or riches. If by chance you did end up with some property because all the men in your family had already died, they could not bequeath it to anyone. It would be basically seized and returned to the community. Essentially defined as legally incompetent. Now, while Irish women could divorce, unlike other Celtic women, their reasons that they could divorce were far narrower for men who wanted a divorce. And lastly, Celtic men could have more than could have more than one wife, but women could not have more than one husband. All right, so the Morrigan as sovereign. So in the myths, the sisters were frequently challenging the authority of men. This might be why they were demonized, right? Because that culture really didn't really like it. Um, so remembering that Bide terrified the kings with visions of their death. In one myth, though, the Maka claims a kingship. And in this myth, the Tonbo Ragavna, also known as the cattle raid of the important calf, we return and we hear from Cuchulainn again, who returns as the central star of the two following cattle raiding epics. So in this story, he's woken up by the sound of cattle roaring, and he runs naked into the yard. His wife is following after him with his clothes. And he and his friend race towards the sound, where they find a very strange sight, a chariot pulled by a single red horse with a single leg. The shaft of the chariot goes through the horse to the front of its forehead, and sitting in the chariot is a red-haired woman with red eyebrows, wearing a red cloak which hangs down the back of the chariot, dragging on the ground behind her. And seated next to her is a big man in a tunic carrying a forked white hazel stick, which he's using to drive the cow. So Cuchulainn stands in front of the chariot, does not let the couple move forward. Now, we talked about what the color red meant to the Celts, or the Irish Celts. And this is a color of death. Okay. So we already know this is a pretty bad omen for Cuchulainn. So the Cuchulainn starts to challenge this woman and says, what are you doing with her? And he says, you know what? This is not your cow. It doesn't belong to you, your friend, or any of your friends. And he says, well, whatever. I'm an Ulsterman, and this cow is mine. Oh, no, go back. Okay. And so she starts to challenge him. She's like, who do you think you are? And he's like, well, who do you think you are? And why is the woman speaking to me? Why isn't the man speaking? Well, the woman answers again, and she says, well, you didn't talk to the man, you talked to me. And so the man starts to taunt them because the woman is speaking and not the man. And so she says, hey, look, here's the guy I'm with. Cold Wind, Conflict, Brightness, Strife is his name. It's often argued that this god was the Dagda, who was believed to be the husband of the Morrigan in some of the myths. And so then he responds, the Dagda, or the man in the chariot, says, the woman you are speaking to is keen-edged, small-lipped, plain-cloaked, hair-sharp, shouting fierceness phantom. Okay. So he's mad at this point, and we don't know why. We don't know why. That maybe he's proclaiming a name that's like, yeah, who do you know, it could be this situation where the guy's like, you don't know who this is? This is Beyonce. He's like, whatever, that is not Beyonce. Oh my God, don't mess with me. Or he's upset because what he's saying to them is kind of gibberish, at least to us, but may not have been to the original people. And so he's all like, well, don't you know who I am? And so she starts to mock him. She says, well, you're a small man. I know who that is. And this cow is my payment. And I got it for a poem that I delivered. And Cuchulainn asks her to say the poem. Now, this is Cuchulainn's problem. So it was believed among the Celtic Irish that you could actually speak a truth into being. So talking about the following poem, in which she prophesizes Cuchulainn's death, she's basically speaking it into being. Cuchulainn, she's positioning herself as an my internet's unstable. I hope that I am able to, this is still going out. So she not only prophesizes his death, but she also prophesizes a very great battle to come. Okay. All right. I'm going to skip ahead to this. They exchange more fighting words, and then she takes her cow and she goes back into the she-mount. Okay, somebody else is saying their internet is also unstable. All right. So it's probably appear in the Tonbo Cúailnge, which is the most famous Irish epic. It's even thought that in the previous story, the Morrigan actually starts this. So whether this is through her own purposes, or she basically is representing a calamity that follows at the hands of men. This is also a story about feminine sovereignty. that is and shows the challenges that the women of this era have. The Queen Maeve and the King Alil basically start having a conversation. They're married and they start having a conversation about their riches. And it turns out that Queen Maeve is actually a little bit poorer than her husband. She's down one bull, so to speak. And so she asks the neighboring king to borrow his bull so that she can breed a calf of equal strength to her husband's bull. And at first he says yes, but then he changes his mind after some of his Maeve soldiers taunt him, and he says, "No, you can't have the bull." Well, in order to keep her power and her kingship, she decides to go to war and to rescue the bull, or to steal the bull, essentially. Now, here's the problem. Remember the myth 2 myths ago when Macha cursed all of Ulster, saying, when you're in danger, you're all going to have labor pains for 5 days and 4 nights. Well, it's Ulster, and Ulster is in danger. So all the men are having labor pains and they can't get out of the bed. So they have to bring back in Cuchulainn, who is safe from this curse because he is considered to be, he's only half mortal. So he has all the power. He's also supposed to be like 12 years old in this picture, whatever. So he begins to defend Ulster all by himself. So a bit like a modern day superhero. Well, the Morrigan shows up and she disguises herself as a beautiful and regal young woman wearing clothes of many colors. And he says, "Well, who are you?" Doesn't recognize her. And she says, I'm the daughter of King Boan. So she's a princess. And she's like, "I've got you cattle and I've got some riches. I've heard some great stuff about you and I'd like to get together." And he just basically dismisses her and he says, "Listen, I don't have time for sex or love or whatever. I'm very busy." And she's like, "No, no, it's not just about sex or anything like that. I actually can help you." But he can't hear that. He thinks that she's just only into love and into his, his cut abs. And so he dismisses her. And so now she's mad. Okay. So she says, starts threatening him, and they start taunting each other, much in the same way that the warriors at the beginning of these Celtic Irish battles used to taunt them. So she's saying, "Look, I'm going to turn into an eel. I'm going to curl under your feet, and I'm going to trip you up while you're in the river." And he says, "Yeah, you know what? If you become an eel, I'm going to crack your ribs with my toes, and you're always going to be hurt until I lift the injury with my blessing." And she's like, "Yeah, well, I'm going to turn into a she-wolf, and I'm going to chase cattle into the battle, and you're not going to be able to fight." And he's like, "Well, I'm going to bust out your eye, and you're going to be missing that eye forever unless I say so." And she comes back again. And she says, "Well, I'm going to turn into a cat. I'm going to a hornless red heifer, a cow, and I will lead the cattle in and run all over you in the ford, and you will not know me at all," she said. And he's like, "Whatever, I'm going to break your legs and you will never heal unless I offer a blessing." Okay. So that leads us to the shapeshifter goddess. So, in addition to later in the story of the Tombo Cunha, the Morrigan does turn into all of those different birds. And she begins to shapeshift. So, and other things that she shapeshifts into, we saw that she turned from, she turns from a hag into a beautiful regal woman. And then she also, the Macha in a different story could turn into a leper, which she does in order to keep her kingship when it is under threat from men who are far inferior to her, but still think that they are able to conquer her. So shapeshifting is a big deal in the Celtic myths and mythology. So it may have been a symbolic description, such as "I saw the face of God in that bear." It may have described scenes of battle. So Celtic warriors were said to be so mired in their work when they were fighting that they were described as having the frenzy of wolves or the strength of bulls. And certainly women who are contorting their faces and voices to mimic warbirds represents a kind of real shape shifting. Okay. So we may be losing some cultural context. It may have always meant to be a symbol and not actually turning into these kinds of animals. But my husband has a theory that it might have been an actual battle tactic description. When we were in County Kerry a couple of years ago, we met a woman who told us a story that the Tuatha Dé Danann would turn into yellow flowers and that they would then turn back into warriors when it was time to defend Ireland. And that this may have been a camouflage tactic. They may have developed cloaks or whatever, or hiding underneath them, waiting until their enemy comes by and then be able to take them by surprise. It may have been a symbolic description of the land goddess. Whether or not the Morrigan is a land goddess is a subject of a lot of contemporary debate. But it in some schools of thought, a land goddess would naturally be able to shift into different animals or to different energies because the land is constantly shifting, right? So the Morrigan and shape shifting. These are some of the animals, oops, that she becomes. Um, so the horse is a bit of a stretch. We don't actually see the Morrigan turn into a horse, but there is a powerful horse that is the companion of Cuchulainn, who is known as the gray steed of Macha. So it's possible that that horse was connected to Macha or the Morrigan in some way. All right, I'm going to skip this myth because we just don't have a lot more time. Basically, the moral of the story is Macha turns herself into a leper, ties up all the men who are trying to overthrow her throne, enslaves them, makes them build her a fort. So she is awesome. Okay, so this is where we start to get into a little more controversy, and I put this picture up here because it tends to describe what we like modern day people tend to think of the land goddess as being very sweet and benevolent. I would say that's probably not true right now for a lot of us in the Pacific Northwest, and we're dealing with a very fiery, destructive land goddess, so to speak. But that kind of idea of this, we've all seen that it, but that image of a serene, constantly giving goddess is something that's actually very contemporary. For a lot of human history, land goddesses were very fickle. It was believed that they went to war. Land could one year be very plentiful, and then the next year seem to abandon the people and not produce any crops at all, right? Or could produce storms. It's thought that I'm going to switch over to the next. So this is called Murna Magana, otherwise known as the Mound of the Morgan. Oh, I'm sorry, this is not the Mound of the Morgan. This is called the Pops of Anu. Basically, because they look like breasts. Those two tiny dots in the middle, basically where the nipples would be, are actual burial cairns left by the Stone Age Irish, and they were where their important dead were buried. And so it's believed that that was intentional, that these two structures were put there as a way of returning these souls to a mother goddess, right? So there's a number of land structures that are named for the Morrigan. Sometimes some of them have to do with water, other ones have to do with land. The idea of the Morrigan as a land or fertility goddess is up to a lot of debate, because the Morrigan also doesn't really seem to be associated with crops. She's also, we see her controlling the elements. We don't see her really being the source of any of this. So that may be just a different understanding, and that the Celtic or Iron Age Irish didn't see the land goddess as we did. Or we may have a goddess that really isn't of the land, but still has control of the land. Again, there's a lot of things we just don't know. But what we do know is that it was believed that the land goddess went to battle, that she herself was a warrior, and that she would sometimes like attack the warriors with the weather. So it's in Ireland, you can see how that might make sense, because you have one side of the hill is warm and dry and easy to plan your attack, and the other side, you're getting a ton of rain and mud. So it's easy to see how somebody might have thought the land goddess has chosen a side and is fighting with or against one specific side. So we also think about the fact that the Morrigan, you're not sure which side she's on. Is she with you or she's against you? Well, we certainly experience that right now in Pacific Northwest. Does the land love us or hate us? Right? I mean, where I live, we have the best wine in North America. I'm just going to come out and say it. I'm in the Willamette Valley. Okay. Our Pinot Noir grapes are the best, but we also have a lot of fire. So does the land want us to be drunk and happy, or does she want us to die? I don't know. And I just feel like the Celts might have had some similar experiences. Right? So, okay. I'm going to skip through some of these last ones because we just don't have a lot of time left. So I did want to show you, some other resources that would be good for checking out. Two books by Morgan Daimler, which are excellent, short books, easier to to go through, easy to read. I mean, sorry, easy to read. They're easy to get through because they're not very long. The Morrigan and the Raven Goddess. Also, Morpheus Ravenna has one called the Book of the Great Queen, a little thicker and not as easy to come by, but you can order it online. And then definitely check out the Irish Pagan School. They do have online courses and resources, and so you're learning about Irish mythology and Irish worship from native Irish sources. And ending it with this beautiful picture of the Dulo Valley, which to me is a great place of contradiction. It's a place of absolutely astounding beauty. It's where my husband and I spent part of our honeymoon. It's also a place of great sorrow. A lot of people died there during the famine. And so I think that in many ways represents the Morrigan. You know, she is a source. I wouldn't even say she is a source of either of these things. I don't consider the Morrigan a source of strife, and I don't consider her a source of blessing. But I feel like she is a goddess that holds space for both, and that's where she has certainly been a great guide in my life. And that's the cover of my book. So I'm going to take this off screen share now, and let's come back and let us talk. So Rachel says, I wonder if her role is something like what we would consider fortune. Gosh, or I don't know. I think it's there's so much that we have about the I think it depends on what you define as fortune, and we don't really know how the Celts would have seen fortune. They don't really have a character in there that represents fortune in the way that the Greeks did. So answer is I don't know. Maybe. Yeah. Address the connection or possible connection between the Morrigan and Queen Maeve. Okay. So great question on that one. So not a lot of concrete connections there. It is thought that Queen Maeve was born in a cave, Awutnagat, which is a powerful space that is connected with the Morrigan. It is thought this is a space the Morrigan can enter in and out of. So there's thought that they might have a connection that way. I feel like their greatest concrete connection is through the Tonbo Cúna, the cattle raid of Cooley, because it really is starring Queen Maeve and her desire to get the bull and to continue to be powerful in her own right. And the Morrigan kind of started that battle, as did Maeve. So they certainly share some similarities, but the concrete connection is a little more nebulous. But then again, a lot of connections in Irish mythology are nebulous. So I really recommend reading all of the Tonbo Cúna. One of the recommended translations is by Thomas Kinsella. You can get really inexpensive copies online, or ask for it at your local bookstore. And we really need to support our local bookstores right now. So yeah, other questions? Let's keep talking. I'm also okay if people want to turn off their mic and share that way too, or chat is fine. Meantime, I can tell you all where to reach me. My microphone's trying to fall, so I'm going to have to type with one hand. So my website is courtneyaweber.com. There you can join my mailing list. You can also book me for tarot readings or find out where I'm doing other classes. I am speaking next weekend at Columbia Willamette Valley Pagan Pride, which is all virtual. Not speaking on the Morrigan. I'm with my podcast. I also have a podcast. So That Witch Life. And so recommend, please follow us because we have a very good time. A lot of great speakers and things we can talk about and drop every Monday. So yeah, what else do we want to talk about while we're still here? I'm also on all the social media portals at the Cocoa Witch. Yay. Will there be recording of this lecture? I did not record this one, but it looks like it's live on YouTube, so I don't know how long it will be up there. So I may record another one at some point and release it. The best thing to do is to follow me on my newsletter. So if I do offer it again online, you can figure out where it will be. But also, again, check out the Irish Pagan School. They've got a lot of recorded lectures on the Morrigan, which are really, really excellent. And, if you're interested in this goddess, definitely learn from as many people as possible, because there's a lot of different things that I haven't covered that they will, and vice versa, so And again, this is my book. It's called The Morrigan, Celtic Goddess of Magic and Might. And you can get it online. Certainly, it's available on Amazon. You can also get it through me on my website. But I really encourage people to please consider supporting your local independent bookstores. Most metaphysical bookstores will carry it. If not, they will order it for you. So we've got a few more minutes here. Happy to just sit with y'all for a bit. I don't even see your faces. I just see these cute little pictures. I see somebody at Cannon Beach. Stephanie's at Cannon Beach, or was at Cannon Beach. Hi, Kay. How are you?
I'm great, thanks. How are you?
I'm doing okay. My house is not burned, and it didn't have to evacuate, so about as good as can be expected.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah. All right. Well, that's all, guys. And I guess I'll wrap up here and move on to the rest of my day. And I hope you all have a wonderful, wonderful rest. Oh, you're most welcome. Thank you for being here. I know there's a lot of great stuff going on. Please, thank you so much to Puget Sound Pagan Pride for having me, and to Rachel for moderating. This was really, really helpful. And don't forget to check out the rest of the Pagan Pride. And yes, vote, vote, vote. Absolutely. Be well, everybody. Take care, and talk to y'all soon.
Thank you so much, Courtney. That was a wonderful presentation. And we thank you again for coming to join our Pagan Pride Fest this weekend. So we hope you have a great day. And yeah, to everybody else who may be listening, we are hosting more presentations up until 5 p.m. Yeah, and thank y'all for being here. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.